Welcome back to Rising. We have just completed the vice presidential debate between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. Now, I thought it was a very commanding performance throughout from J.D. Vance. Tim Walz struggled a little bit at the beginning to find his footing. He obviously recovered from that point on, but J.D. Vance continued to really deliver rhetorically. Let's get into some of the issues that came up in the second half. Very interesting to hear some discussion of censorship, that kind of category. That was J.D. Vance's pivot away from discussing election denial and what Trump had to do on that. Obviously, Vance in the difficult position of defending some really hard to defend conduct from Donald Trump, but he does his best on that. What did you make of the second half of the debate?
I do think that was interesting. All these existential conversations that are happening on both sides of the aisle, really, for the swing voters. I mean, on the left, Democrats are talking about democracy over and over and the stealing of the election and stop the steal, you know, commentary. They're talking about this endlessly on the campaign trail, along with the economy and other issues, and economy is the #1 issue. But on the right, they're also talking about the economy, but these issues of free speech, COVID, tech oligarchs. I mean, it was, I call it QAnon. I feel like that was the QAnon quarter. Like in the final quarter, he started bringing up the QAnon conversation. Vance could not admit that Donald Trump lost the election. Why is he in this position today? He is there to replace Pence. And he pivoted to something that he knew his base cared about, and he knew could excite folks, just as Walz talked about democracy, which is an existential issue in my opinion, but...
I think J.D. Vance should just admit that Donald Trump lost the election. He wasn't able to do that, and that's unfortunate. However, I do not think it's just QAnon adjacent to care about some of the free speech issues, and Tim Walz did not reassure me at all. I mean, he could have just said, no, we're not going to engage in censorship. You heard what his answer was. His answer was, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's always a tell when you hear that. It's a common statement we hear. It is abjectly false. The line, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, comes from a World War I era Supreme Court decision that was to disallow people from distributing leaflets opposing that war. That Supreme Court decision was subsequently overturned. So anyone who cites that precedent is citing a precedent that was used to enforce censorship that no longer exists. So that doesn't exactly reassure me as someone who is very critical of the Biden administration for the efforts it engaged in to pressure social media companies to take down speech. Is it the only or most important issue in the world? No, but if you care about that, and I do, I was not at all mollified or set at ease by how Tim Walz addressed that.
I mean, I say it was the QAnon segment because suddenly Vance pivoted to his donors, his base, and possibly people backing his campaign. He said, oh, Russians didn't determine, 500 Russians buying Facebook, $500,000 in Facebook ads bought by Russians didn't influence the election. And Tim Walz said, January 6th wasn't determined by Facebook ads. Now, it was just an interesting pivot because we went from serious commentary and serious debate. I didn't agree with all of it. I thought a lot of it could have been fact-checked a little bit more aggressively in the QR code that didn't seem to work. But with that being said, that last quarter turned into the online debate. It was like, whoever's still hanging out here. And by the way, Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance is like, guess what, Peter Thiel? I'm not going to use all your talking points. And my most loyal soldiers, I'm going to talk about the Facebook ads. I mean,
we had an hour and a half
of folks who are they're us. They're the people who are the most online.
But we got to that at the very end. We had an hour and a half of a very substantive debate and discussion of economic policy and outsourcing and protecting American workers and immigration and how that intersects. We did all of that. I think it was fine to spend a few minutes on the end on these issues that do matter to a lot of Americans. Vance is right that Hillary Clinton said Donald Trump was an illegitimate president in 2016, in part because of the minuscule efforts made by Russians on social media, and she should not have done that.
It is true.
No, it is absolutely true that she said that.
Russian spies have been called out. Come on.
That's not why she lost. You know that's not why she lost. She lost because she didn't campaign in Michigan and Pennsylvania.
That's not what they said. I'm the first person.
She said Donald Trump was an illegitimate president.
I am the first person to say Hillary Clinton not having an office in Wisconsin was her biggest mistake. But death by 1,000 cuts is still death by 1,000 cuts. Not having an office in Wisconsin, Jill Stein pushing narratives. I'm not saying that her votes lost her the election, but death by 1,000 cuts. I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter. Do you think I love that Tulsi Gabbard and now we have RT consultants who were surrogates on the Bernie Sanders campaign are suddenly, part of that narrative? No.
Well, that's now, but they didn't do any. What did they do in 2016?
They were useful idiots. It's an old term. It's not that Russia influenced the election and won it for Donald Trump. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Hillary Clinton, they took advantage
but would you agree there was a massive,
Stupid
and I don't want to
campaign.
spend too much more time on this, but that there was a massive amount of focus on the Russian stuff in the mainstream media as the main explanation for what had gone wrong. That was their default assumption instead of one of many things that were. I would agree it was one of a number, but that was the obsession of both the Hillary Clinton campaign herself and the mainstream media, and I think that was a mistake.
Two things can be true at once, right? So Russia did intervene in our election. They did meddle. They, as did other countries, disinformation campaigns.
Right, we meddled in theirs. They're meddling in ours. We're all doing a little bit of meddling.
Well, he won 95% of the vote. So, okay, but they meddle in our elections, right? Mm-hmm. And they meddle in disinformation campaigns. They have spies here. That's just how the world works, right? Simultaneously, she had weaknesses in her campaign that they exploited. Simultaneously, the Democratic Party stripped their funding of all 50 states and lost 1,200 seats over the course of 8 years. Barack Obama's Democratic Party decided, hey, guess what? We're no longer going to invest in our state parties. We're going to put them only into presidential elections. And so as a result, you had no Democratic Party narrative over the Obama years, and that led to, a Wisconsin party not being funded, and Hillary Clinton's campaign thinking, oh, we don't need to open up an office in Wisconsin, and Bill Clinton even saying, and that was published in that book Shattered, hey, you should have opened up an office in Wisconsin, and Robby mocking him. Bill Clinton, he mocked Bill Clinton.
He really let down people named Robby. Yeah. All right, let's spend a few more minutes on this actual debate. There was more interesting stuff on immigration, childcare, healthcare. Now, I've mostly, again, praised Vance's performance, even though I don't substantively agree with him on a lot of stuff. One area where I thought he was a little weak was describing how to bring down childcare costs. He finishes this answer about how that immigrants are responsible for so many things costing more that I don't know is quite economically sound, and he wants to have less of that. And then he said something about inducing people to provide more childcare options. And I'm thinking well, one way to have more childcare options would be to have more immigrants, working, teaching, and daycare jobs and those kinds of things. So I don't know that was a great answer.
He also blamed
J.D. Vance
housing costs on immigrants. I mean, everything. It was like, here's a problem in the economy, and they blame the immigrants. And that is Donald Trump's strategy. It doesn't flow.
I mean, it's where the American people are. They think there's too many immigrants, and something has to be done
about it. And they want
to
blame immigrants for everything. But when J.D.
I mean,
Vance
you don't get anywhere arguing against them on that.
But J.D. Vance, when he says it doesn't flow the same way as Donald Trump, J.D. Vance is in this position, he is doing what he does well. He's the Yale Law School, Silicon Valley investment banker. He is the guy who's going to articulate the best message, as opposed to Tim Walz, who's the folksy guy who likes to talk on the street. They're the inverse of each other. J.D. Vance can't talk to the folks at the donut shop, but he can debate very well. Tim Walz did a decent debate. I wouldn't give him an A+. I wouldn't give anybody an A+ in this debate.
Way short of A+.
I would give him a B. And I would give J.D. Vance a B+, but there's for different reasons, right? J.D. Vance's rhetoric was, it was ridiculous. I started writing things down. I'm like, you're blaming immigrants for housing costs. You're blaming Kamala Harris for things that happened 50 years ago. It was wild. It was, if you actually break it down, he was just more measured. He was using Donald Trump's rhetoric, but in a more measured way. And he would just throw out these, I agree with you on some things, Tim Walz, because he has his negatives are higher than anybody else in this race. He's higher than Donald Trump's, higher than Kamala Harris, and definitely higher than Tim Walz. He had to overcome his negatives by playing somebody who's civil, but having the same policies as Donald Trump just...
Well, I think he did that very effectively.
I think Tim
Walz
but it wasn't an A+.
Struggled, and I don't think it's going to matter very much because it was the VP debate in a year where overwhelming majority of people's minds are probably made up by now. But if you were undecided and you were watching the VP debate, I bet you were probably impressed by J.D. Vance. I said this in our last segment, but I have to be thinking Donald Trump if he watched that, I assume he was watching that, or at least is watching the response on cable news afterward, is saying, "Attaboy, JD, that's my guy. He did a good job." He's probably pretty happy with him.
Probably.
We'll see if Kamala Harris feels the same way, and we will have more Rising tomorrow, and we're also going to continue with The Hill's live coverage of the debate, turning it now back over to Michael Schnell for The Hill. Thanks for tuning in.